Navigating the tricky U.S. relationship with the United Nations will be one of the biggest foreign policy challenges for the next president. Almost since the founding of the United Nations in 1945, the United States has had an ambivalent and often fractious relationship with the world body. On the one hand, no country did more to establish the United Nations and to shape its charter, and none has been as active in using it as a foreign policy tool to serve its national interests. And yet the UN has been a long-time lightning rod for critics who charge it with being an infringement on U.S. sovereignty and freedom of action, a lair of cronyism and mismanagement, and a cesspool of anti-American values and anti-Israeli rhetoric. The U.S.-UN relationship has been particularly fraught in situations of divided government, when one party holds the executive branch and the other at least one house of Congress. This was most apparent during the administration of Bill Clinton, when Republicans in Congress, led by Senator Jesse Helms and others, waged a campaign to reduce U.S. reliance on the UN and impose management reforms on the world body, including through the controversial policy of withholding U.S. assessed financial contributions. So as a political football, the question of U.S.-UN relations is a hardy perennial. At the same time, administrations, regardless of political stripes, have found themselves returning again and again to the United Nations. They do so to accomplish purposes the U.S. can't achieve on its own, to share the burdens that might otherwise fall entirely on the United States, and to win legitimacy for U.S. efforts, as in the campaign against Libya or sanctions on North Korea. We saw this even in the administration of George W. Bush, which, despite Iraq, in its second term, returned to the UN to get peacekeepers into Lebanon. The next U.S. president will face 5 major challenges at the United Nations. First and foremost is ensuring vigorous Security Council attention to stopping the nuclear threat from Iran. The next administration must persuade Russia and China in particular of their fundamental interest in preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which would likely lead to a nuclear cascade throughout the broader Middle East. Moving fast on this is critical, particularly because Israel has given clear signals that its patience is running out. My reading is that Russia and China can be persuaded to adopt harder measures, perhaps in return for diplomatic side payments, to avoid unilateral measures. The second priority is bolstering UN peacekeeping, which is buckling under the strain of deployments in 16 countries involving more than 100,000 troops. In fact, it's the second largest military deployed anywhere in the world. Blue helmets are a great bargain for the United States, which spends only about a quarter for every dollar spent to keep peace in places where the United States doesn't want to send its own troops on the ground. But budget-conscious legislators on Capitol Hill have peacekeeping in their sights, and the president will need to hold the line. Third, the next president will need to continue transforming the Human Rights Council from a den of human rights abusers into an actual champion and defender of human rights. Over the past 3 years, vigorous U.S. diplomatic efforts have secured some major victories. These include condemning the regime in Syria, ejecting Libya, and appointing a special rapporteur for Iran. But there are still no rigorous criteria for membership, and abusers often get a free ride. The next president must resist the temptation to turn his back on the Council and instead continue to reform it from the inside. Fourth, the president has a golden opportunity to lead on global development. For more than a decade, the motivating targets for alleviating poverty have been the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, which have helped rally major, if uneven, progress. The MDGs will expire in 2015. The next administration should propose a set of sustainable development goals as their successor, geared towards balancing social and economic development with environmental conservation to ensure that in making societies richer, we don't kill the planet. Fifth, the next administration must keep pushing hard for UN reform, particularly to the organization's management and budget. There are still too many pockets of cronyism and corruption, and some of the UN departments and programs are bloated, wasting taxpayer dollars and alienating Congress. There needs to be a way of winding up initiatives that have outlived their usefulness through the introduction, say, of sunset clauses. Finally, the United States must take a more vigorous stance on the expansion of the UN Security Council by advocating a modest enlargement of the permanent membership to include major emerging powers, but based on transparent criteria. Making this change is essential if the Council is to have the political support and power it needs to defend peace and security in the 21st century.